They had been told the Americans would arrive with bullets. So when the first word they heard was medic, the world seemed to stop. No one stepped forward. No one stepped back. There was only silence and a wounded child lying in the dust. Nothing they were seeing fit inside their understanding of war. And whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The boys were lined up behind a broken fence, watching the empty road like it was a doorway to the worst day of their lives. The fence had once kept chickens in. Now it held teenagers back from a war they didn't fully understand. The wood was splintered, the wire bent in places, and the posts leaned like tired men. But it was still something to hide behind, still something to grip when your hands didn't know what else to do. Their rifles felt heavier than they ever had before, not because the metal had changed, but because the meaning had. Somewhere down the street, a door creaked open, then another. A window shifted. Curtains moved like someone was breathing behind them. You could feel the village watching without looking too openly, the way people do when they're scared of being seen. Then came the sound every one of them had been listening for since sunrise. Slow boots on gravel, not running, not rushing. Just a steady, measured crunch, 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 like the road itself was counting down. The youngest among them swallowed hard and whispered, "They're coming." No one answered him, because everyone already knew. They'd rehearsed this moment in their minds 1,000 times. The older boys had even spoken about it like it was a test. Like if they stood the right way, held their rifles the right way, looked brave enough, they could control what came next. But your imagination always lies to you in war. In your head, you're steady. In your head, you do the right thing. In your head, you don't feel your heartbeat climbing up your throat. In real life, the air is colder than you expect. Your fingers go numb. Your mouth goes dry. And your thoughts don't line up neatly like soldiers on a parade ground. They scatter. The first American soldier appeared at the far end of the road, half silhouetted by morning light and dust. He was taller than the boys expected. Or maybe he only seemed taller because he walked like someone who belonged there. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't shout. He just stood for a second, scanning the houses, the broken windows, the frightened faces peeking from behind curtains. The boys tightened their grips. Some of them were barely old enough to shave. One had a thin line of fuzz above his lip he kept touching when he thought no one was watching, like it proved he wasn't a child. Another had a scarf tucked inside his collar because he still got chills in the mornings. A couple of them carried letters from home folded in their pockets, already worn soft from being opened too many times. Those letters were their last connection to normal life, to kitchens and radios and hands that weren't shaking. They had been told the Americans were monsters, that they would laugh at suffering, that they would punish villages just for existing. That mercy wasn't in their language. And yet, this soldier didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in a long time. More Americans came into view behind him, spread out, moving carefully. Not like a parade, not like conquerors, like men walking through a place where anything could happen. The boys' hearts thudded harder. One of the older teenagers, the one who always spoke like he knew things, muttered under his breath, "Stay ready, don't let them see fear." As if fear was something you could hide the way you hid bread. Then from somewhere close, too close, a child cried out, sharp, desperate. A sound that didn't belong to soldiers or strategy or flags. A sound that belonged to the real cost of all of this. Every head turned. Near the old bakery in the open part of the street where the sunlight hit the dust, a small boy lay twisted on the ground. His shirt was torn. His knees were scraped raw. And there was blood, too much blood, soaking into the dirt beneath him like the earth was trying to swallow it before anyone had to look. His sister knelt beside him, shaking, her hands already stained red as she tried to press them against the wound. She kept saying his name again and again, as if naming him could hold him in place. The German teenagers froze. This wasn't supposed to happen yet. This wasn't part of their rehearsal. No one practiced what to do when a child is bleeding in the street while the enemy walks in. For a heartbeat, their minds tried to do the old thing, turn it into blame, turn it into hatred, turn it into a reason. But the child didn't care about reasons. He only cared about pain. The American soldier saw him and something changed in his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't victory. It was a quick, sharp focus, like a switch had flipped from soldier to human. And then he started running, not toward the fence, not toward the boys, toward the child. The German teenagers didn't move. Their bodies locked up like someone had nailed their boots to the gravel. The American dropped to his knees in the dirt, right beside the wounded boy. He ripped open his pack, hands moving fast. He pressed a cloth to the wound. He spoke in a voice that wasn't loud but firm, like he was trying to pull the child back with his words. The sister flinched away at first, terrified. She looked at the teenager behind the fence as if asking with her eyes, "Is this a trick? Is this how it starts?" The older boy's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then the American shouted over his shoulder, voice cracking through the street like thunder. "Medic, I need a medic over here. Now." The word hit the boys like a slap. Medic, for a German child. For the enemy. No one had taught them what to do with that. Another American rushed forward, then another. Their boots slapped the ground as they knelt and pressed bandages and checked the child's breathing. They worked like the child mattered, like his life was not a political statement, not a symbol, just a life. A German woman finally ran forward, unable to hold back. Then another. Then the girl's mother, her face pale, eyes wide, hands shaking so violently she could barely reach her son. The boys expected the Americans to push them back. They didn't. They made space. One soldier looked up at the mother, his face streaked with dust and sweat, and he nodded, small, quick, serious. It wasn't a smile. It wasn't pity. It was something else. It said, "We're trying. We're not leaving him." The oldest German teenager felt something inside him slip out of place. Like a belief he'd carried too long had finally snapped. He had been fed pictures of the enemy, simple, clean, ugly pictures. But the men kneeling in the dirt weren't pictures. They were breathing. They were sweating. They were scared in the way people get scared when someone might die in front of them. The wounded boy gasped, a thin, wet sound. The medic pressed harder, jaw tightening. He called out again, sharper this time. Another soldier looked down the road and waved frantically. For a moment, the entire village forgot the war. No shouting. No marching, no grand speeches, only the sound of a child fighting to stay alive. And the enemy fighting right alongside him. One of the German teenagers lowered his rifle without realizing it, then another. The metal dipped toward the ground like their bodies had finally accepted what their minds couldn't. The bakery door creaked again. An old man stepped out, hands trembling, clutching a folded letter in his coat. He stared at the scene as if he'd stepped into the wrong world. Because back then, people believed war was lines on a map. Fronts, borders, armies. But war also lived here, in quiet streets and broken fences and children who didn't know why their world was ending. The medics exchanged a look. One of them stood and shouted something down the road. An ambulance was coming. And as the sound of that engine began to grow in the distance, the teenagers felt it. The shift, not just in the street, inside themselves. This wasn't just a strange moment anymore. This was the beginning of a truth they wouldn't be able to unlearn. And as the ambulance drew closer, dust rising behind it, the boys realized the next few minutes would decide more than a child's fate. It would decide what they believed about humanity itself. If you're feeling that tension right now, stay close. This is where the story turns, quietly, painfully, and all at once. And if you want more real moments like this preserved and told with care, you'll find them here on History Captured. The word medic was still hanging in the air when the distant engine finally became real. The boys had expected bullets, but now they were watching an ambulance roll toward their street. It came slowly, carefully, like even the driver understood this road didn't forgive mistakes. The tires crunched over gravel and broken glass. Dust lifted behind it in a soft cloud, floating through the pale morning light. One of the American soldiers waved both arms, guiding it in. The teenage boys behind the fence stayed frozen, their eyes darting from the ambulance to the wounded child to the soldier's hands. Everything felt upside down. Their bodies were still braced for violence, But the scene unfolding in front of them was built from urgency, not hatred. As the ambulance stopped, the back door swung open. A stronger smell hit the air, something sharp and clean that didn't belong in a ruined village. Antiseptic, gauze, metal trays. The scent of places where people were meant to live. Two medics jumped down, moving like they'd done this 1,000 times and still never got used to it. "Move, move," one of them said, not angrily, just focused. They slid a stretcher out, and for a moment the street filled with small sounds that felt louder than gunfire. The click of latches, the rustle of fabric, the fast breathing of people trying not to panic. The wounded boy's sister was still kneeling close, her hands trembling, her face streaked with dust and tears. She kept leaning toward her brother as if her body could shield him from whatever came next. An American soldier gently touched her shoulder, not grabbing, not yanking, just a soft pressure. She flinched at first like she expected pain. But the soldier spoke quietly, voice low and calm. The words were English and she didn't understand them, but she understood the tone. It wasn't the tone of a threat. It was the tone of someone saying, "Please let us help." Slowly she backed away. The mother arrived then, running, half stumbling, one shoe loose like she'd forgotten to tie it. She dropped beside her son and tried to touch his face, but her hands hovered, afraid to hurt him more. One of the medics glanced up, meeting her eyes, and nodded once. That nod was strange. It wasn't permission. It wasn't control. It was reassurance. The boys watched the mother's shoulders shake as she tried not to collapse. They watched her mouth form silent words, prayers or pleas. They watched the medic press a fresh bandage down and then tighten it with quick, practiced hands. And they noticed something else. The American medics weren't acting like soldiers at all. They were acting like fathers, like brothers, like men who'd seen children bleed before and hated it every time. They lifted the boy carefully onto the stretcher. His body jolted and he let out a weak cry. The sound punched straight through the teenagers behind the fence. One of them winced like the cry had landed in his own ribs. The medic leaned close, speaking softly again, words the family couldn't understand, but the voice was steady and warm, the kind of voice you'd used to calm a frightened child during a storm. The stretcher rolled toward the ambulance. This was the moment the boys expected something to go wrong. They expected a shove, a shouted order, a gun raised, anything that would snap the world back into the version they'd been warned about. But the Americans simply worked together, lifting the stretcher into the back with care, guiding it in like it was made of glass. The mother tried to climb in after him. A soldier gently held his hand up, not to stop her forever, just to pause her. He pointed to the front seat, then to her, then to the ambulance. He was saying, in the simplest way possible, "Ride there. Stay close." She hesitated, eyes wide, still trapped in the old fear that every move could be punished. Then she nodded and stumbled toward the front, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve like she was ashamed of being seen crying. The sister stood in the road, hands empty now, staring at the blood on her palms as if she couldn't understand how it got there. A German woman, maybe an aunt, maybe a neighbor, wrapped an arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. The ambulance doors closed. The engine rumbled. And as it began to pull away, one of the medics turned his head and looked back at the teenagers behind the fence. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. The teen who'd stepped forward earlier, the one who couldn't stop replaying that nod, that look, that kneeling soldier, felt his throat tighten. He didn't know why. He didn't even know what emotion it was exactly. It wasn't gratitude yet. It was confusion mixed with something dangerously close to hope. The ambulance rolled down the road, dust rising behind it like a curtain. And when it disappeared around the bend, the street stayed quiet. Not the calm quiet of peace. The stunned quiet of people who have just watched something they didn't believe was possible. The teenagers remained behind the fence, rifles lowered, shoulders tense. Their mouths were slightly open, like their bodies still hadn't accepted the new shape of reality. Then slowly, the village began to move again. A woman picked up the boy's small shoe from the road and held it against her chest like it was a sacred thing. The old man from the bakery stepped forward, bending down to look at the dark stain soaking into the dirt. He muttered something under his breath, words that sounded like a prayer and a complaint at the same time. One of the older boys finally whispered, "Why did they do that?" His voice wasn't challenging. It wasn't angry. It was lost. No one answered him because every answer they'd been given their whole lives suddenly felt useless. A younger teen swallowed, eyes still fixed on the road where the ambulance had gone. "They're not supposed to care," he said, like he was repeating a rule. "They're not supposed to care about us." And that's when one of the American soldiers, still in the street, wiping his hands on his uniform, looked over. He didn't look offended. He didn't look proud. He just looked tired. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, wrapped in paper. He tossed it gently onto the ground near the fence. The boys flinched as if it might explode. But it didn't. It was just a piece of candy, a cheap, simple thing. The kind of thing that would have meant nothing in another life. But here, in this street, it felt like a message. One of the boys stared at it, then looked up. The American soldier made a small motion with his hand like he was saying, "It's all right. Take it." The boy didn't move at first. It wasn't pride holding him back. It was fear of what acceptance might mean. Because taking candy from the enemy wasn't just taking candy. It was admitting they were human enough to offer it. Finally, the boy crouched down, keeping his eyes on the soldier, and picked it up. The paper crinkled in his fingers. The American soldier nodded once, then turned and walked away. The teenagers watched him go, and for a moment none of them spoke. It wasn't silence of obedience anymore. It was silence of realization. In their heads, war had always been painted in clean colors, good on one side, evil on the other. But what they had just witnessed was messy, real, impossible to fit into a slogan, and that messy truth was going to follow them. That night, as the sun sank and the cold returned, the boys would go back to the room where they slept, crowded together, boots still on, rifles stacked in the corner. Someone would find an old radio that worked if you turned the knob just right. And when the static finally cleared and a faint song slipped through, they would sit there listening like men twice their age. Because outside, the war was still happening. But inside them, something had already changed. And the next time they saw the Americans, it wouldn't be through the same eyes. They watched that ambulance disappear, and for the first time all day, the street felt louder after the danger passed. Nothing had exploded, but something inside those boys had. That evening, they went back to the small room they'd been using as a shelter, an old storage space behind the schoolhouse, cold enough that your breath still showed even indoors. Their boots left dusty marks on the floorboards. Their uniforms smelled like sweat and smoke and fear that wouldn't wash out. No one was hungry, even though their stomachs were empty. They sat in a rough circle, backs against the wall, rifles stacked in the corner like they belonged to someone else. The youngest boy kept rubbing his thumb over the crinkled candy wrapper in his pocket. He didn't eat it. He just held it like proof the day had really happened. For a long time, the only sound was the wind pushing against the building. Then one of the older boys, Carl, cleared his throat. He'd been the loud one earlier. The one who spoke like he was sure of things. "They must have done it for show," he said, but the words didn't land with any power. Even he didn't sound convinced. "Show for who?" another boy asked. There was no camera, no crowd. Carl opened his mouth, then closed it again. A third boy, Lucas, stared at his hands like they belonged to someone he didn't recognize. "I saw his face," he said quietly. "The medic's face. He looked scared." "Scared of what?" Carl snapped, more out of habit than anger. Lucas swallowed, scared the boy would die. That sentence sat in the room like a heavy object nobody wanted to pick up. Because if that was true, if the enemy could be scared for your child, then war wasn't a clean story anymore. It wasn't heroes and villains. It was something messier, something human. The youngest boy finally spoke, voice thin. "My mother said they'd hate us," he whispered. "She said they'd hurt us." No one corrected him. Not because they agreed, but because they couldn't explain what they'd seen. Someone reached into a pocket and pulled out a folded letter, edges soft from being opened too many times. He didn't read it, he just held it. Like holding a letter was the closest thing to safety he had left. In the corner, the old radio sat on a crate. It had been dead for weeks, but earlier that day someone had said it might work if you turned the knob just right. Nobody had bothered. It felt pointless. Songs didn't stop tanks. Still, Lucas reached over and tried. He turned the knob slowly. Static filled the room, loud and harsh. Someone flinched. He turned it again. The static shifted, and for a second there was nothing, pure silence. Then faintly a melody slipped through. Not clear, not strong, but real. A simple song, thin as a thread, like it had traveled a long way to find them. The boys didn't speak. They just listened. Music does something strange in a war. It doesn't fix anything, but it reminds you that there was a world before the fear. A world where people danced and argued about silly things and complained about the weather instead of the sound of boots on gravel. The youngest boy's eyes filled, and he quickly wiped them, embarrassed. Carl pretended not to notice. After a while, Lucas said, "What if we were wrong?" Carl turned toward him. "Wrong about what?" Lucas didn't rush the answer. He chose his words carefully, like stepping around broken glass. "Wrong about them," he said. "About what they are." Carl's jaw tightened. "They're still the enemy." "I know," Lucas said, nodding. "I know what they are on paper. I'm not stupid, but today they didn't act like monsters." No one argued with that because they couldn't. The youngest boy finally reached into his pocket, pulled out the candy, and unwrapped it slowly. The paper crackled in the quiet. He stared at it like it might disappear if he blinked. Then he put it in his mouth. For a second, nothing changed. Then his face shifted, surprise, almost confusion, as the sweetness hit his tongue. It was such a small thing, such a childish thing. And yet it made the room feel different, like the world had cracked open just enough to let something softer through. Carl looked away. He didn't want anyone to see the way his expression softened. Outside, the village stayed uneasy. You could still hear distant movement, engines far off, a door slamming, a dog barking once and then going quiet. War was still there. It hadn't left. But inside that room, something new had begun. Not peace, not friendship, just a question that wouldn't go away. And once a question like that enters your mind, it starts changing what you notice. Because the next day, when the Americans walked through the village again, the boys wouldn't just see uniforms and rifles. They'd see faces. They'd see hands. They'd see the small things like photographs and tired eyes, and the way a man pauses when he hears a child cry. And that's where the real shift was about to happen. Out in the open, in daylight, when nobody could pretend anymore. The next morning, the air felt different, still cold, still tense, but no longer simple. The boys returned to the broken fence and took their places like they always did, except now they were watching with new eyes. The road stayed empty for a while. Dust sat undisturbed. A few crows hopped near the ditch, pecking at something they'd found. In the distance, a dog barked once and stopped, as if even it knew to keep quiet. Then the Americans appeared again, not running this time, not rushing. Just walking through, scanning windows, checking corners, moving like men who'd learned to expect trouble in every shadow. The boys felt their bodies tighten automatically. Fear doesn't disappear just because you've seen kindness once. Fear is stubborn. It stays in the muscles, but something else stayed too. Memory. Lucas spotted the medic among them, the same one from yesterday. He recognized him by the way he carried his bag and the way his head turned toward the houses, not like he was hunting, but like he was checking if anyone needed help. The medic paused near the fence. His eyes swept across the boys, then rested for a moment on the youngest one. No words were exchanged. No gestures, just a brief look. Then the medic moved on. Carl watched him go, jaw tight. "Don't stare," he muttered, as if staring meant surrender. But even Carl couldn't help noticing the small things now. An American soldier had a worn photograph tucked into his helmet strap. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. Another carried a dented canteen and kept tapping it against his thigh, a nervous habit. One soldier's sleeve was stained dark, dried blood that wasn't his. They looked like men who had been through too much. And that was a dangerous thought because it made them harder to hate. Down the street, near the bakery, The old man had propped the door open. He stood in the doorway with a broom in his hand, pretending to work but really watching. He looked at the Americans the way you look at a storm, still wary but no longer surprised by thunder. A child peeked from behind his mother's skirt. The mother pulled him back quickly, whispering something sharp. The Americans didn't react. They just kept moving. A few minutes later, a woman approached hesitantly from a side lane. She was holding a small bundle, cloth wrapped tight like she'd tied her courage into a knot. She stopped when she saw the soldiers and froze, eyes wide. The medic broke away from the group and walked toward her slowly, hands visible. The boys behind the fence held their breath. They expected shouting, pushing, something hard. Instead, the woman lifted the cloth slightly, revealing a baby's face, pale, fussing, too quiet for a child that small. The mother's lips trembled as she spoke rapid German, words full of panic. The medic didn't understand the language, but he understood the fear. He gently touched the baby's forehead with the back of his hand. Then he looked at the mother and made a simple motion, 2 fingers to his own chest, then outward like he was saying, "I can help." He signaled to another medic. They opened a small kit right there on the street. The mother kept glancing at the teenage boys as if asking, "Is this safe? Is this real?" None of the boys answered because they didn't know what to say. They were watching the enemy check a baby's breathing. The medic worked quickly, then handed the baby back. He said something soft, calm, steady, like he was trying to put strength back into the mother's body. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes, then backed away, clutching the baby to her chest like it was the last light in the world. When she disappeared into the lane, Carl exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath without realizing it. "This is madness," he murmured. Lucas didn't take his eyes off the medic. "No," he said quietly, "it's something else." The youngest boy shifted his weight, staring at the ground. "Do you think the other boy is still alive?" he asked. Lucas nodded. "They said he woke up." The youngest boy's shoulders sagged with relief so visible it almost hurt to see. He rubbed his hands together like he didn't know what to do with them. For the first time since the Americans arrived, the boys weren't just thinking about themselves. They were thinking about what kind of world could exist after this. The Americans eventually moved on, their boots fading down the road until the village was quiet again. But the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of questions. And the boys didn't know it yet, but those questions were about to collide with something even harder, something that would force them to choose between what they'd been taught and what they now knew was possible. They kept thinking about the baby all afternoon. It wasn't just what the medic had done, it was how he'd done it. No hesitation, no performance, just a man responding to fear with care. The boys sat near the fence as the light began to tilt toward evening, their shadows stretching long across the road. A few villagers passed by, whispering in low voices, glancing toward the places where the Americans had walked. Lucas finally said what none of them had been brave enough to say out loud. "If they really hated us, they wouldn't do these things." Carl didn't respond right away. He kept watching the road, jaw tight. "That doesn't make them our friends," he said. "No," Lucas replied, "but it doesn't make them monsters either." The youngest boy traced shapes in the dirt with his boot. "My father always said monsters don't help babies," he murmured. That simple sentence landed hard. They went back to their shelter as dusk fell, the wind colder now, carrying the smell of smoke and something sweet from someone's kitchen. A woman was baking bread somewhere in the village, trying to keep life normal. Inside the shelter, the radio crackled again, and this time the music came through clearer. Someone leaned their head back against the wall and closed their eyes. Carl finally spoke, quieter than usual. "What if the stories were wrong?" Lucas looked at him. "Then what?" Carl exhaled. "Then everything is harder, because that was the truth. It's easy to hate a shadow, it's harder to hate a person." Outside, a group of American soldiers passed, their voices low, their laughter tired. They sounded like any group of men after a long day. The youngest boy stood near the door, listening. "They don't sound like they're winning," he said. Lucas smiled faintly. "No one wins this." That night, they didn't talk about battles or flags or victory. They talked about the boy who'd lived. They talked about the baby. They talked about what they'd seen. And with every word, the old picture of the world peeled away just a little more. Tomorrow, the village would face something new, a test of courage that didn't involve weapons at all. The next morning arrived wrapped in a strange kind of calm. Not the calm of safety, but the calm that comes after a storm when everything feels too quiet to trust. The boys returned to their post by the broken fence. They stood in the same places, wore the same uniforms, held the same rifles. But inside, none of them were standing where they had been before. Carl kept glancing toward the side road that led past the bakery. Lucas watched the windows. The youngest boy stared at the dirt, still thinking about the baby, about the chocolate, about the medic's hands. A small group of villagers gathered near the square. Not many, just enough to look like coincidence. A woman approached the fence slowly, her steps careful. In her arms she held a basket covered with a cloth. She stopped a few feet away from the boys. "For them," she said quietly, nodding toward the road where the Americans usually passed. Carl stiffened. "That's dangerous." She met his eyes. "So is everything now." She placed the basket on the ground and stepped back. Inside were apples, bread, and a jar of honey. The boys stared at it. Lucas whispered, "We can't." "We also can't pretend nothing's changed," the woman replied. Then she turned and walked away, leaving the basket behind like a question no one wanted to answer. When the Americans came later, they slowed when they saw the basket. One of them looked around, uncertain. The medic recognized the boys. His eyes flicked to the basket, then to them. No one spoke. Finally, Lucas stepped forward. He didn't smile. He didn't salute. He just nodded. The medic hesitated, then returned the nod. One of the soldiers picked up the bread. Another offered something in return, a tin of coffee. The exchange took less than a minute. But in that minute, the village crossed a line. Not a political line, a human one. As the Americans moved on, Carl whispered, "If anyone sees this." Lucas answered, "They already have." From the bakery door, the old man raised 2 fingers in a small, tired salute. That afternoon, the boys didn't know whether to feel brave or afraid, because they had just committed an act of quiet rebellion, not against armies, but against the lie that said compassion had no place in war. And the consequences of that choice were still on their way. By the following day, the whole village seemed to know what had happened. No one said it out loud. They didn't need to. You could feel it in the way people looked at each other, a little longer, a little more carefully. You could hear it in the way doors closed more softly, like no one wanted to make a loud decision. The boys returned to the fence, and for the first time since the war had reached their street, they weren't just waiting for something bad to happen. They were waiting to see what kind of people they were becoming. The Americans appeared late in the morning, the same group, the same medic, the same tired walk of men who carried too much in their bones. The youngest boy noticed one of the soldiers limping. Another had his arm wrapped in a dirty bandage. They weren't untouched. They weren't winning heroes from posters. They were men paying the same price everyone else was. A small girl slipped out from behind her mother and ran toward the road. The boys stiffened. So did the Americans. The child stopped in the middle of the street, holding something in both hands, a flower, crushed and bent, but still bright. She looked from one side to the other, confused, then held the flower out toward the medic. For a second, nobody breathed. Then the medic knelt down and took it. He said something soft, his voice almost swallowed by the wind. The girl smiled and ran back to her mother. The medic stood, holding the flower awkwardly, like he didn't know what to do with it. The soldiers around him pretended not to look, but every one of them noticed. The boys watched in silence. This wasn't surrender, this wasn't victory, it was something fragile and dangerous. That evening, Carl admitted what he'd been afraid to say. "If this ends badly, it will be because we let ourselves care." Lucas nodded. "And if it ends well, it will be for the same reason." None of them knew which future they were walking toward, but they knew they weren't walking blind anymore. Days moved forward, slow and uncertain, like the village itself was learning how to walk again. The boys kept their watch. but the fence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a line they stood on, 1 foot in what they had been, 1 foot in something new they didn't yet understand. The wounded boy finally returned home one afternoon. They heard about it before they saw him. The news passed from door to door in quiet excitement, the way good news always does when people are afraid to celebrate too loudly. When he appeared in the street, supported by his mother and sister, the boys felt their chests tighten. He was thinner, pale, moving carefully, but he was alive. The sister spotted the boys by the fence and smiled at them. She lifted her hand and waved. The boy did too, slow and clumsy. None of the boys realized they were smiling back until their faces hurt. Later, when the Americans passed through, the mother stood in the doorway holding the boy's hand. She nodded once toward the medic. He stopped. She pressed her hand to her heart. The medic didn't speak. He just returned the gesture. No one else saw it, but the boys did. That night, they sat in their shelter with the radio humming low. No one talked about war. They talked about what they'd do when this was over, where they'd go, who they'd become. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something that had been taken from them. It felt like something waiting. And the boys understood then that the moment on that dusty road hadn't just saved a child. It had saved them too. Soon, the Americans would leave the village. And when they did, nothing would ever be the same again. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or remember something important about what it means to be human, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. This is what we do here on History Captured. We preserve the moments history books often forget, the quiet ones that still shape who we are. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, take a second to subscribe and share this video with someone who still believes that even in the darkest times, kindness matters. I'll see you in the next one.